Clara Hill, a quiet veteran bearing a prominent scar from her service as a field medic during Operation Enduring Freedom, found solace working at Benny's Corner Cafe. Her past, filled with heroism and hardship, was hidden beneath her apron, but the scar told a silent story of courage earned under fire. One afternoon, a group of loud tourists disrupt the cafe's peace. A man cruelly mocks Clara's scar, leaving the diner in a stunned silence. While adults avert their gaze, a teenage cadet named Jacob Meyers, deeply affected by the disrespect shown to a veteran like his own late father, contemplates what real leadership looks like. Will he break the silence and stand up for her? If this powerful story of courage and standing up for what's right resonated with you, please consider supporting our channel. Like this video, subscribe for more inspiring narratives, and share it to spread the message of honor and respect. Your engagement helps us share these vital stories. If it were up to me, I wouldn't let someone like that serve food. The words were spoken loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. The room immediately froze. Clara, standing near the coffee station, was as still as a statue. Her face, half turned in profile, revealed the scar that curved from her ear down to her jaw, a scar so obvious that it felt like the only thing anyone could see. The air grew thick with discomfort. Nobody dared look her in the eye. But then something broke the silence. A chair scraped against the floor, and the sound echoed across the room. Slowly, deliberately, a teenage boy in a sharp cadet uniform stood up. His mother, sitting at the table, whispered something, her voice pleading with him to stay seated. He didn't budge. With clenched fists and a determined jaw, he walked across the room, each step heavy with resolve, and stopped beside the man who had spoken. Everyone watched, the tension hanging like a thick fog. The boy's voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "That scar represents honor," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You only have a mouth." And just like that, the silence shattered. Benny's Corner Cafe stood at the edge of a sleepy road in rural Kentucky, wedged between an old gas station and a bait shop that hadn't changed its sign since 1994. The place was the epitome of small-town charm. The coffee was always hot, the jukebox was slightly out of tune, and the regulars didn't need to glance at the menu, they knew it by heart. The bell above the front door chimed with each new customer, and everyone knew each other's name, except for the ones passing through. Behind the counter, Clara Hill, 48, moved with the efficiency of someone who had been doing the same job for years. She wore a faded blue apron and a silver name tag, but it was the scar running from the corner of her left eye down to her chin that marked her most. Most people didn't mention it. The regulars had learned, either by instinct or decency, that it was a topic best left untouched. They simply thanked her when she brought their bite and maybe left a generous tip. But the scar had a story, whether anyone asked or not. 16 years ago, Clara had been a field medic during Operation Enduring Freedom. She never spoke about what happened in Kandahar, but those who knew her well understood that the scar wasn't the result of some random accident. It was earned under fire. She'd been stabilizing a young private whose leg had been shattered by an IED when a second mortar hit. Clara took shrapnel to the face, the force of it slamming her into the side of a medical Humvee. The young man survived, but Clara never found out his name. After 3 surgeries and a medical discharge, Clara returned home. Not to applause or ceremony, but to silence. There was a stack of VA paperwork waiting for her, aching joints, and a job in a kitchen she never asked for. Now she worked 6 days a week at Benny's, serving pancakes instead of plasma. That afternoon, the lunch crowd was typical. Truckers sat at the counter, flipping through newspapers. A retired couple sat by the window, splitting a grilled cheese. The rhythm was comforting. Take the order, fill the coffee, smile, repeat. Clara found solace in the predictability. After the chaos of war, there was peace in the routine. Then the bell rang. 5 of them walked in, 3 men and 2 women, all wearing designer sunglasses and jackets that screamed, "Not from around here." Weekend tourists probably on their way to one of the lake resorts that had recently become trendy. The kind of people who found charm in rustic diners, as long as the Wi-Fi was strong and the food had hashtags. Clara greeted them with her usual warmth. "Welcome to Benny's," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be taking care of you today. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man in the tailored navy blazer, The one who looked like he'd never turned a wrench or broken a sweat lowered his menu and met her eyes. His gaze locked onto the scar, following the line of it like it was a roadmap leading to something unpleasant. He winced, actually winced. Then, just loud enough for the table to hear, but too loud for it to be anything but deliberate, he muttered, "Yikes, did Halloween come early?" One of the women at the table chuckled, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was the kind of nervous laughter people make when they're trying to fit in, even if they're not sure what's funny. Clara didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to. Instead, she simply said, "I'll give you all a moment with the menus," and turned away. But the man wasn't done. "Hey," he called after her, his voice rising. "I asked you a question. What happened to your face?" Clara didn't respond right away. She simply stood there, her back to him, focusing on the order she had just taken. In that moment, she didn't need to say a word. You fall asleep on a chainsaw, and everything freezes. The diner comes to a sudden halt. Forks hang suspended in midair. Conversations cut short as if the very air has thickened, unwilling to let sound escape. The whole place holds its breath. Clara stands, her back turned to them, unmoving. She doesn't turn, doesn't offer them the dignity of a glance. Instead, she speaks quietly, her voice a measured calm. "I'll send another server to your table." Her words float in the stillness as she walks toward the kitchen. Her movements are steady, controlled. Her shoulders square, her posture rigid, but her eyes, those eyes, betray the quiet sting, just barely. Later, people will mumble that they didn't know what to do, that they were too shocked to speak up. Someone else should have said something, they'll claim. But silence, you see, carries weight. It has a way of letting cruelty settle in the center of a room like it's the guest of honor, like it's earned its place. Clara had carried that weight before, across hot sand, under a scorching sun, beside dying men who never made it back. This was just another scar. Not visible, maybe, but no less real. People forget that millions of veterans carry their battles every single day. Not all scars show. Some hide beneath sleeves, between ribs, behind quiet smiles in diners like this one. But they're there. They're always there. Clara sets the tray down in the kitchen. Her hands tremble ever so slightly, just like they did in the early days after she was discharged. She focuses on lining up the water glasses one by one, edge to edge. She steadies herself the way she did years ago in a combat tent. Flashlight in one hand, morphine needle in the other, fighting the chaos with every ounce of calm she could muster. Behind her, the laughter drifts back in, rising from the table of tourists. Somewhere near the back of the diner, a boy in a cadet uniform pauses, his fork halfway to his mouth. His eyes are fixed on her, watching. Clara never talked about Afghanistan, not because she'd forgotten, but because there was too much to remember. Sometimes when the steam from the kitchen rises just right, mingling with the clatter of plates and the sharp smell of grilled onions, it carries her back to that heat. The real kind. The kind that rises off sand and fire, that gnaws at your skin and gnaws at your soul. She was 29 when she first deployed. A combat medic with steady hands, a gift for calming soldiers twice her size with nothing but a firm look and a soft voice. They used to joke that Clara could stitch a wound faster than most guys could load a rifle. And honestly, it wasn't far from the truth. The day it happened, they'd been ambushed near a supply route outside Paktika province. A convoy took a hit, 3 men down. Clara sprinted toward the burning Humvee, her medical bag bouncing at her side, heart thundering in her chest. Gunfire popped in the distance, but her world had narrowed to those wounded men. One had a tourniquet on but was still losing blood too quickly. Another had burns, the third just a kid, maybe 19, who wasn't moving. She dragged them to cover one by one, applied pressure, and called for evac. When the mortar came, it didn't whistle like it does in the movies. No, it slammed into the earth, hard and sudden, ruthless in its silence. She never saw the fragment that cut her face, just the blood, the pain, and then nothing. 3 soldiers lived because of her that day. No medals, no ceremonies, just recovery rooms, forms to sign, and a long flight back to the States where nobody was there to greet her at the airport. The VA called it non-life-threatening trauma. She called it her second birthday. But what came next was far harder than the shrapnel. Her discharge papers arrived with a mountain of red tape. Appointments were delayed. Disability benefits? Under review. The scar on her face healed faster than the paper cuts from government forms. For a while, she lived out of her pickup truck, slept under overpasses, brushed her teeth at gas stations. A local church offered hot meals a few nights a week, and she accepted them without pride, without complaint. People looked at her sideways, a woman alone with a soldier's posture and an empty look in her eyes. They didn't ask if she'd served. They just assumed she'd made bad choices. That's how it goes sometimes. But then things started to turn. Benny's Corner Cafe wasn't hiring when Clara first walked in. But the owner, Ben Strickland, had seen that look in her eyes. He knew it. A Vietnam veteran himself, Ben recognized it. The distance, the heaviness behind her gaze. Without asking, he offered her a job. She took it without hesitation, without fanfare, without any illusions about what she was walking into. The diner had become her new battlefront, where survival was measured not in firefights, but in the quiet way she served, the steady calm she brought to the chaos of the cafe's lunch rush. Clara could feel the exhaustion in her bones, but there was a flicker of fight still lingering beneath the surface. She didn't need to explain herself. Ben didn't ask about her scar. He didn't need to. "I can pay cash until we get the paperwork sorted," he said, his voice steady. "You know your way around a kitchen?" "Yes, sir," Claire replied, her words cautious but respectful. He chuckled. "You say sir one more time and I'll have you clean the fryer." She laughed, the sound light, almost foreign. It was the first time in weeks that a genuine smile crossed her face. Ben had a way of making her feel safe, even if it was just for a moment. Ben was old school. He didn't talk much about his time in Vietnam, just mentioned he'd been in the bad parts. But he watched Clara closely those first few weeks. Not out of distrust, but because he understood what her silence meant. He noticed how she flinched at loud noises, how her eyes darted around a room as if scanning for threats, how she never seemed able to fully relax. Even something as simple as pouring coffee left her tense. Eventually, Ben stopped watching her so closely, not because she'd changed, but because she showed up every day early and reliable, her calm demeanor becoming a constant in the cafe. Benny's ran better with her there. The regulars got used to the scar, or at least stopped staring at it. Small towns were like that. People would wave at you from their porches, ask about your dog, your garden, your kids. But they never asked the questions that mattered. They knew Clara was a veteran, knew she'd been hurt, but that was as far as it went. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to. They didn't know what to say, so they said nothing at all. But Clara didn't need the questions, the pity, or the fanfare. What she wanted was something simpler. Peace, routine, dignity. She found that at Benny's. Stacking syrup bottles, flipping coffee filters, wiping down booths. There was something sacred in those small, repetitive tasks. After the chaos of war, repetition became her therapy. Yet the ache never fully left. It wasn't just the physical pain in her knee or the occasional throb in her jaw when the weather changed. It was the ache of being forgotten, of knowing she had given everything she had and come back to a world too distracted to notice. Heroes don't always get the welcome home they deserve. No banners, no parades. Sometimes they're handed aprons and told to smile through the shift. And Clara did, because that's what service looked like, even off the battlefield. That afternoon, Clara just wanted to get through lunch. No drama, no scenes, just table numbers and refills. But cruelty has a way of finding the quiet ones. As she tried to steady her breath in the kitchen, she felt it, the weight of the room shifting. The man who had mocked her was still laughing, but now someone had noticed. A boy in a cadet uniform. A boy who had seen everything and hadn't looked away. Jacob Meyers hadn't taken a single bite of his lunch. His grilled cheese sat cold and forgotten on his plate, his glass of sweet tea untouched. His hands rested in his lap, still as stone, but his eyes, sharp, dark, and steady, were fixed on the table near the center of the diner. He hadn't looked away since the man in the navy blazer made the first cruel remark. At 16, Jacob was tall and lean, all elbows and knees, still growing into his body. His uniform, a crisp gray with deep blue trim and a brass pin just below the collar, marked him as a cadet at Riverside Military Academy, one of the most prestigious prep schools in the state. It was an honor to wear it, but today it felt heavy. He had expected little from a stop in a small-town diner, just a quiet lunch with his mom, on their way home from visiting his late father's memorial in Lexington. But then the man opened his mouth, and no one did anything. Not one person spoke up. Not one adult corrected him. Jacob had always been taught that grown-ups were supposed to lead. That's what his instructors had drilled into him. Follow, honor, lead with courage. Yet here in this small diner, everyone froze. Even the veterans with their ball caps and military decals on their jackets stayed silent. Eyes averted, forks spinning food in circles. It made his stomach churn. Across from him, his mother Laura glanced at him, concern shadowing her face. She recognized the look in her son's eyes, his jaw clenched tight, the tension radiating off him. She knew something was about to break. Jacob's muscles tensed beneath the surface of his skin. His right hand twitched slightly, as if reaching for something invisible. "Jacob," Laura whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Don't." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. "I don't deserve that," he muttered, his tone heavy. "I know, honey," she said, a hint of sadness creeping into her voice. "But this isn't our fight." Her words trailed off, an unspoken weight hanging between them. "That's the problem," he added softly, almost to himself. "It's never anyone's fight until someone makes it theirs." Laura sighed, her worry overshadowing any anger. She could see the shift in him, the changes he'd gone through since Michael had died 2 years ago. She could still recall the knock at the door, the way it felt like the world had stopped, the folded flag in her hands, and how Jacob hadn't cried but hadn't spoken a word for 3 days either. Since then, everything had changed. Jacob had thrown himself into his studies, into the academy, with a ferocity that even his instructors found rare. He never spoke of his father much, but the dog tags he wore beneath his shirt every day spoke louder than words. And when it came to the uniform, his father's uniform, Jacob noticed everything. He saw the disrespect, the mockery, and he couldn't ignore it. From the corner booth in Benny's cafe, Jacob had watched every moment unfold. He had seen the way the waitress's shoulders stiffened, the slight tremor in her hand as she carried the tray to the kitchen. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, but there was something else, something deeper, that she carried with her. He'd watched the man at the table, the one who mocked her, belittle her with his words. He made fun of the scar on her face like it was a joke, a punchline to a cruel story. It wasn't something to laugh at, it was something that deserved respect. Jacob didn't know her name, but in that moment, he understood her. He knew her story, not the specifics, but the unspoken truth beneath it. He had seen it before, in the eyes of the men at the base, in the VA waiting rooms, and in the faces of the people who walked differently, who spoke less after their service. Those were the marks of war, the ones you couldn't see. Those were the scars that lasted. He reached up, his fingers brushing the brass pin on his chest, a small eagle engraved into a circular seal. He had earned it last semester for leading a search and rescue drill under pressure. It had been a proud moment. His mother had cried when they pinned it on him. But today it felt hollow. It wasn't just about drills or ceremonies. It was about moments like this. Jacob's fork scraped against his plate as he pushed it aside. Laura's eyes snapped up and she quickly whispered, "Jacob, wait." But he was already standing. In the center of the diner, the man in the navy blazer was still laughing with his companions. Their laughter was now strained, awkward, but the cruelty was still there. The waitress had disappeared, replaced by another older woman who nervously took their order. But Jacob wasn't paying attention to them anymore. His gaze was fixed on her, the waitress, the one who had been the target of their cruelty. She was by the coffee station, organizing mugs, her movements deliberate, her face unreadable. She pretended not to hear the whispers still swirling around the room, but Jacob saw through the act. Her posture was straight, proud, but the weariness in her shoulders was impossible to ignore. So was the strength. Jacob exhaled, recalling his father's words. Courage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly and refuses to sit down. Today, those words rang louder than ever. He took one step, then another. The air in the cafe began to shift. Not because someone shouted, not because fists were raised, but because Jacob had decided he wouldn't sit back down. His shoes hit the diner floor with a soft, measured rhythm, the sound barely louder than the hum of the overhead lights. But in that moment, it felt like a drum roll to him. Each step was deliberate, purposeful. As he neared the table by the window, the man in the navy blazer looked up, his smile faltering when he saw Jacob. He hadn't expected confrontation, especially not from a teenager in uniform. "Well, look at this," the man smirked, nudging one of his friends. "We got ourselves a junior G.I. Joe." Jacob didn't flinch. He stopped directly beside the table, standing at attention, his hands at his sides in parade rest, just like he had been taught. The diner fell silent. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died. Even Clara, standing by the coffee station, paused in her tasks. The man in the navy blazer stared at Jacob, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't expecting this. Not from a kid. But Jacob was done waiting for someone else to step in. The moment had come, and he wasn't going to back down. Jacob turned slowly, his gaze lifting in confusion at first, before recognition struck him, freezing him in place. His voice, calm but piercing, carried through the room, as though it had been waiting for this moment. "That scar," he said, his gaze shifting toward Clara, "represents honor." His voice remained steady, not needing to rise in volume to command attention. He didn't shout, didn't have to. The weight of his words carried themselves. "You," he continued, his eyes narrowing and fixing directly on the man across from him, "only have a mouth." A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Somewhere near the counter, a spoon clinked softly against the rim of a ceramic mug, adding a quiet punctuation to the tense silence. The man, whose bravado had been so evident moments ago, now faltered, his smirk slowly fading away. "Listen, kid," the man began, his posture stiffening as he sat up straighter. "This is adult business. Why don't you go back to your PlayStation and let the grown-ups talk?" But Jacob didn't let him finish. He cut him off smoothly, his tone cool but firm. "I know exactly what this is. It's cowardice, dressed up as confidence." At those words, the entire diner seemed to lean in, not merely out of curiosity, but because Jacob had spoken aloud what so many had silently thought but never dared to say. He gestured again, this time toward Clara. "She didn't ask for your opinion. She didn't ask to be stared at or mocked. She served her country, risked her life, saved lives." The man scoffed, rolling his eyes in disbelief. "Oh, please," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't even know her." "I don't have to," Jacob retorted. "I know her type. My dad was one of them, and he taught me how to spot courage when I see it." At the mention of his father, Jacob's mother lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, her emotions welling up despite her best efforts to hold them back. Jacob didn't look at her, though. His eyes remained locked on the man, his words now turning toward the rest of the room. "She carries her scars in the open," he said, voice steady. "Most people hide theirs. Behind suits, behind money, behind ugly words meant to make them feel bigger." The room was silent for a beat. Then from the corner, a gruff voice broke the stillness. "He's right." The man slowly turned on his stool, his eyes scanning the room as the truth of his isolation sank in. He could feel it now. He was completely alone. His former allies were silent, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One of the women at the table reached for her purse, her fingers trembling slightly. Another man muttered, "Maybe we should go." But still, the man in the navy blazer tried to recover some of his swagger. "It was just a joke," he said, shrugging. "People are so sensitive these days." Jacob's expression remained calm. "Jokes are supposed to be funny," he said, his voice unwavering. "Cruelty isn't comedy." Then his gaze softened as he turned toward Clara. For a brief moment, the uniform and the bravado melted away, and he was just a boy again, standing up for something real. "Thank you," he said quietly, a simple but sincere expression of gratitude. Clara's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to choke her words. She hadn't spoken since the exchange had started, but now she stepped forward, slowly. Her voice was soft, steady. "What's your name?" "Jacob Meyers," he replied, his eyes not meeting hers directly. "Riverside Military Academy." Clara's smile was small but warm, a flicker of recognition, and something deeper in her eyes. "Ma'am," Jacob added, "your father would be proud." Clara blinked, her heart squeezing in her chest at the mention of her father. Jacob's words hung in the air between them, raw and real. Jacob held her gaze, fighting back the swell of emotions threatening to rise. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I hope so." Just then, Ben, the owner of Benny's Corner Cafe, appeared beside the man's table, wiping his hands with a towel. He glanced at the man and placed the check down on the table with deliberate finality. "I think it's time you paid up," Ben said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man opened his mouth to protest, but Ben wasn't having it. "You've eaten enough," he said, his words like a verdict. "Now kindly finish your business and don't come back." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. The man and his companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. Without a word, they tossed a few bills onto the table. A tip, but not out of kindness. It was the kind of tip left only out of guilt. But it didn't matter anymore. Something had shifted in the room. The heavy silence that had hung so thickly earlier was now replaced with a quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't applause. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that said, "We saw that." The kind that said, "Finally." As Jacob returned to his table, Clara watched him with a newfound sense of peace, a peace she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, the scar on her face wasn't the first thing people noticed. Today, it had become something else entirely, a symbol. As the lunch crowd at Benny's Corner Cafe began to thin and the afternoon sun pushed west, casting long shadows across the floor, the room remained quieter, warmer. Not because of the confrontation, but because something had changed. And everyone who had witnessed it knew it. The checkered floor beneath Clara's feet had once been a place where the laughter of others came at her expense, the kind of laughter that made her skin crawl. But now it was a different kind of sound. The echoes of that laughter were gone, replaced by quiet conversations and the soft clinking of dishes being cleared away. It was as though the room itself had shifted, not just in the volume of noise, but in its very presence. The people here now saw her differently. Their gazes didn't linger on her scar, not anymore. They met her eyes. They nodded. One woman even whispered a soft thank you as she left, slipping a folded $10 bill into Clara's hand. Jacob Meyers stood near the counter with his mother waiting to pay. His uniform was sharp, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, but there was something in the way he carried himself now that hadn't been there before. It was subtle but noticeable, a kind of weight that had settled into him in the span of just one meal, as if something inside him had shifted. Clara approached him slowly, wiping her hands on a towel more out of nerves than necessity. "You heading out?" she asked, offering a small, genuine smile. "Yes, ma'am," Jacob replied, standing a little straighter without realizing it. "You don't have to ma'am me," she teased softly. His gaze dropped, almost shy as he seemed to struggle with his words. "Not after what you did today," he said quietly. Clara looked at him for a moment, studying him. He reminded her of someone she had once known in Bagram, a young medic, wide-eyed and full of ideals, always the first to volunteer for danger. That medic hadn't made it back. "You did more than just speak," Clara said gently, her voice soft but firm. "You stood, and that's not as easy as it looks." Jacob hesitated, his gaze flickering toward his mother briefly before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "I wanted to give you something," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He pulled out a small brass pin, worn but polished. It was shaped like an eagle, its wings outstretched, with a shield across his chest. Clara blinked, surprised. "This was awarded to me last semester," Jacob explained, his voice steady but quiet. "For leading a rescue drill during field training. They said I showed courage under pressure." Clara opened her mouth to protest, to tell him he didn't need to give her anything, but he held the pin out between them. "Today," he continued, his voice growing softer, "I realized I didn't earn this nearly as much as I thought I did. You've been living that courage every day." Clara stared at the pin in his open palm, her throat tightening as the room seemed to grow still around her. She could feel the weight of it, the significance, the sheer honesty of his words. "I can't take this," she whispered, the words barely above a breath. "It means something to you." "It still does," Jacob said, but there was a quiet strength in his voice now. "But it means more to me if it's with someone who showed me what real honor looks like." Clara didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked at him, not as a child, not even as a cadet, but as someone who had seen and understood things that most people, even adults, couldn't grasp. His words weren't empty flattery, they were truth. Slowly, Clara reached out and took the pin from him and, holding it with a kind of reverence. She didn't handle it carelessly. She held it as if it were something sacred, something powerful and fragile. She had held morphine syringes in field hospitals with the same reverence, precious, dangerous, and powerful in the right hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jacob nodded once, a simple, quiet acknowledgement. His mother, who had been watching the exchange quietly from the side, quickly wiped away a tear before it could fall. "I think your father would have been proud today," Clara added, her gaze meeting Jacob's, with an understanding that only those who had lost could truly share. Jacob's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard. "So would yours." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade. Everything else, the noise, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, all grew distant. It was as if the diner had disappeared, leaving just the two of them, bound by something deeper than words. Shared service, shared sacrifice, and a shared silence that spoke volumes. Finally, like a soldier returning to her post, Clara straightened. She walked back to the break room, opened the small metal locker where she kept her things, and pinned the brass eagle next to her name tag, C. Hill. It didn't shine the way her other service pins once had, but somehow it felt heavier, more meaningful. As the dinner shift began, Clara moved through the tray with the same rhythm she always had, filling coffee cups, wiping down tables, greeting regulars with a warm smile. But now there was a new weight on her chest, one that wasn't just from the pin. It was the weight of being seen again. Not as a wounded woman, not as a scarred waitress, but as someone who had endured and had the strength to keep showing up. Outside, the Kentucky sky was turning gold, the kind of light that made old tractors and gas station signs glow like paintings, soft and timeless, as if the world itself had paused for just a moment. In that dim light, Clara's reflection caught her eye in the diner's front window. For years, she'd looked at that same face, only ever seeing the damage it had endured. But today, for the first time, she saw something different. She saw survival. There, pinned beside her name tag, the small brass pin gleamed as though it had always belonged there. It was simple, yet it held a weight that words couldn't quite capture. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear aprons, carrying trays in place of rifles. But every so often, a uniform finds its way back to them, not on their shoulders, but in the quiet respect of a new generation. And when that happens, even the deepest scars start to fade little by little. The deepest scars aren't always visible. They don't always show on our skin. Sometimes they live in the way people look at us or in the way they look away when they should be speaking up. Clara's story is not just about one cruel man or one brave boy. It's about how we choose to treat each other, how we choose to see each other. It's about recognizing the battles people have fought, even when we weren't there to witness them. In today's world, we rush through life. We move too fast. We scroll through our screens. We pass each other by. We avoid eye contact. But what people often need isn't pity or applause. What they need is simple recognition. A nod, a kind word, a young man brave enough to say, "I see your sacrifice, I honor it." And that's the real question, isn't it? Have we forgotten how to stand up? Not just for veterans, but for decency, for quiet courage, for the people who serve us day after day without asking for acknowledgement. If you've ever witnessed someone being disrespected and didn't know what to say, what would you say the next time? And if you've been that person standing silently, what got you through? This is a question worth reflecting on. What would you have done if you were in that diner? If this story has touched you, consider sharing it, liking it, subscribing. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for taking the time to listen, for remembering, and for honoring those who carry the weight of service with quiet dignity. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the room says the most important thing.